November 23rd, 1941. The desert air over Libya hung motionless in the pale morning light, carrying the faint smell of oil, sand, and distant exhaust. The first rays of the sun slid silently over the low ridges of the western desert, revealing the scattered shadows of rocks and dried scrub that lay across the barren landscape. Heat had not yet risen, and the desert felt eerily cold, as though holding its breath. On the northern edge of a shallow wadi, half hidden behind a natural rise in the ground, a thin British anti-tank gun line waited, silent, unmoving, almost invisible. The men crouched beside their weapons were coated in dust, their uniforms faded from months under the African sun. They had slept little, they had eaten sparingly, and yet their eyes were fixed forward with the alert, steady calm of soldiers who had been told that everything depended on them. The guns, 6-pounders, 2-pounders, and a handful of heavy 17-pounders dragged into position through the night, rested low against the sand. Their barrels pointed toward the wide, flat approach that stretched for miles across the open desert. The gunners had carefully dug firing pits around each emplacement, shaping the sand with practiced precision, blending their silhouettes into the terrain until they appeared not as machines of war, but as part of the desert itself. Ammunition crates were stacked in shallow depressions. Range tables lay open, weighted with rocks to stop the wind from carrying them away. The men spoke little, their breath making ghostly white clouds in the cool morning air. Far to the west, the rumble began, faint at first, like distant thunder at the edge of storm. The desert sand vibrated softly beneath the men's boots. The sound grew deeper, fuller, shaped into a rhythm that became unmistakable. The synchronized churn of tank engines, the metallic clatter of treads beating across hard earth, the grinding echoes of armored columns closing in. The British soldiers stiffened. Some leaned instinctively closer to the sights of their guns. Others pressed their cheeks against the cold steel breeches, steadying themselves. There was no need for words. The desert spoke loudly enough. Across the flat horizon, dark shapes emerged from the haze. First just smudges, then blocky silhouettes, then unmistakable outlines of Germany's steel spearhead. Panzer III tanks led the formation, their long-barreled 50mm guns pointed forward with unwavering confidence. Behind them came the heavier Panzer IVs, their larger turrets gleaming faintly in the rising light. Stoogie 3 assault guns followed in tight, disciplined lines, their low hulls and powerful 75mm cannons designed to break defensive positions like hammer blows. Armored cars and half-tracks flanked the formation, kicking up plumes of dust behind them. This was not a raid or a probing attack. It was a deliberate armored thrust, well-coordinated, fully supplied, and carried out with the precision of the Afrika Korps. The British gunners watched through their rangefinders. They saw the confidence in the German advance, the way the tanks moved in staggered formation, the way officers scanned the desert from open hatches, the way the armored wave pressed forward without hesitation. The British line, though thin, was positioned along the only viable approach between two rocky ridges. The Germans did not yet realize it, but they were funneling themselves directly toward a prepared killing zone. The British soldiers understood the stakes. The armored thrust ahead of them threatened to punch a hole straight through their defensive sector, a rupture that could unravel miles of front line and expose their supply depots deep in the rear. Sand drifted across the gun barrels as the morning wind picked up. The British crews steadied themselves. Some wiped sweat from their palms despite the cool air. Others breathed slowly, adjusting their aim by millimeters, aligning their sights with the leading tanks. The desert felt unnaturally quiet despite the growing thunder of engines. Even the birds had abandoned the sky, leaving only the low hum of machinery approaching like an unstoppable tide. The Panzer III column crested a shallow rise. sunlight glinting off their angular hulls. Their engines roared as they accelerated, unaware of the danger lying silent ahead. Their commanders believed they faced only scattered British patrols or light resistance. The Africa Corps had broken many defensive lines before. They expected this one to collapse just as easily. The British anti-tank line remained motionless. No muzzle flashes, no movement, no sound, only the barrels, long and dark, pointing toward the horizon like patient predators. As the tanks drew closer, dust clouds swirled around their tracks, forming spiraling columns that climbed into the sky. The armored vehicle's shadows stretched long and sharp across the sand. The growing roar became a physical pressure in the air, vibrating through the bones of every man crouched beside his gun. The British gunners could see now the fine details of the German machines. The spare track links bolted to the front of the hulls, the canvas straps tied down across storage bins, the antennae swaying gently as the tanks advanced. 10 seconds passed. 20. 30. The Germans moved confidently, perfectly aligned, perfectly exposed. Then, as the lead Panzer III reached a marked range on the British sights, one of the gunners tightened his grip on the elevation wheel. The desert breeze slowed. The dust settled for a heartbeat. The world narrowed into the thin metal line at the end of the gun's barrel. The range markers etched into the gunner's mind aligned with the silhouette in his sight. Inside the Panzer III, the commander scanned ahead through the turret visor. He saw nothing but sand, haze, and the faint mirage of heat. No gun barrels, no trenches, no movement. He felt secure inside his armored world, believing only a handful of British vehicles might oppose them. He never saw the gun line. A quiet moment passed, a silence so tense it felt like a held breath across the entire desert. Then the British guns opened fire. The first shot cracked like a thunderclap. The two-pounders recoiled, slamming backward into the sand. The shell streaked across the open desert, striking the leading Panzer the third square in the turret ring. A tiny spark appeared, then a burst. The turret blew upward in a shower of flame and metal fragments. Smoke poured from the shattered hull as it lurched to a stop. Before the echoes of the first shot faded, the second gun fired. Then the third. Then an entire line erupted in a synchronized barrage that shattered the morning calm. Shells tore across the desert. German tanks jerked, swerved, halted, or erupted in flame. The Africa Corps formation faltered as confusion rippled through its ranks. Gunners in the British line worked with relentless precision. Shells slammed into exposed frontal armor. Turrets jammed. Engines burst into flame. The German advance, moments ago steady and unstoppable, dissolved into chaos. And across the battlefield, from turret to turret, one realization spread like a shockwave among the German tank crews. They had driven into a trap, and the guns that waited for them had not come to break. They had come to destroy. Long before the first British shell tore into the leading Panzer III, the story of this moment had been written across months of fighting in the vast and unforgiving deserts of North Africa. The campaign had become a struggle not only of men and machines, but of endurance, supply, and the strategic gamble of two great military minds, General Claude Anlec and General Erwin Rommel. The desert, stretching endlessly from horizon to horizon, consumed everything placed upon it: trucks, tanks, men, even hope. It swallowed mistakes and magnified successes, turning the smallest advantage into leverage that could shift the entire front. Every mile gained or lost mattered. Every convoy that reached its destination, and every one that did not, tilted the balance of power. By late 1941, British forces had tasted both victory and defeat across these shifting sands. They had seen armored regiments decimated in a single afternoon, supply dumps overrun by swift German thrusts, battalions cut off in the open desert with no cover but the thin silhouettes of their trucks. Rommel's Afrika Korps had carved its reputation through these lightning attacks, pushing deep into British-held territory and forcing their opponents into a defensive posture that seemed almost desperate at times. Rommel understood the desert's language. He knew how to hide his tanks behind blind dunes, how to strike from unexpected directions, how to use captured British supplies against their former owners. His armored formations moved with a confidence that bordered on audacity. British commanders understood this too well. They had seen German armored columns pierce through thin defensive lines with alarming ease, scattering infantry and burning through anti-tank positions as though they barely existed. Conventional deployment no longer worked. Static defenses could be overwhelmed. Strong points could be isolated. To stop a German armored advance, the British needed something more precise, more calculated, more disciplined than the enemy expected. They needed to fight with patience, deception, and perfectly executed timing. The anti-tank gun line formed during the night before the engagement was not a random placement of guns thrown together in haste. It was the culmination of weeks of observation, intercepted intelligence, and grim recognition that the Germans would try to exploit the narrow valley between the two ridges. Armored vehicles required maneuvering space, and the desert often forced even the most powerful divisions into predictable paths. The British recognized this terrain feature as both a danger and an opportunity. If they could hold the line here, even temporarily, they could stall Rommel's advance long enough for reinforcements to reposition, for supply convoys to move safely, and for the wider front to stabilize. But there was more at stake than a tactical delay. Behind the British anti-tank gunners lay a chain of vulnerable positions. Artillery batteries repositioning after days of movement. Medical tents treating wounded after earlier clashes. Supply columns still arriving from distant depots. And infantry battalions resting after forced marches. The collapse of this thin line would expose all of them. A successful German breakthrough would cut supply routes, isolate British brigades, and open the door to a deeper push toward the coast. Every officer present understood that if the Germans passed through this valley, the British front might unravel over dozens of miles. The men of the gun line knew they faced not just tanks, but the hardened core of the Afrika Korps, crews who had survived battles from the outskirts of Tobruk to the plains of Cyrenaica. German tankers carried with them a reputation for precision, discipline, and aggressive maneuvering. Their machines, though not invincible, were rugged and well-handled. Panzer III tanks, with their long 50mm guns, had proven decisive against many British cruiser tanks. The heavier Panzer IVs, especially those equipped with the short-barreled 75mm guns, were capable of blasting infantry positions and outmatching lighter vehicles. Even the Stoogie 3 assault guns, originally designed for infantry support, had become deadly tank killers in the right hands. Facing such an armored spearhead with a thin line of anti-tank guns required a level of resolve that only those who had fought the Desert War could fully comprehend. British gunners had to remain entirely exposed. Unlike tank crews who fought from behind armor plating, anti-tank crews worked under open sky, surrounded only by sandbags and shallow pits. When enemy shells landed, there was no steel hull to shield them. If they were spotted, they could be eliminated in seconds. Their only protection was concealment and the hope that they struck first. Yet despite the danger, discipline remained absolute. The British artillery officers had drilled their men relentlessly. Every gun crew rehearsed the sequence of loading, firing, adjusting, and firing again until it became an instinctive rhythm. They studied the silhouettes of German vehicles, memorizing the weak points in their armor. They practiced rapid target identification and adjusted for range, wind, and movement. Even the youngest among them, many barely 20 years old, carried themselves with a hardened seriousness that came only from facing repeated engagements. The night before the attack, as the gunners pulled their weapons into position beneath cover of darkness. They worked without lanterns, without chatter, guided only by the dim glow of the stars and the faint outline of the ridge above them. They moved slowly, carefully, checking elevation mechanisms, greasing breech blocks, aligning stakes in the sand to mark firing arcs. When the final guns settled into place, most of the men leaned heavily against their weapons, exhausted but determined. They understood that their work would soon be tested under fire. At higher command levels, reports had been grim. Reconnaissance units had sighted German tank battalions massing beyond the horizon, accompanied by half-tracks and artillery elements. Intelligence officers predicted an armored strike at dawn. The Germans believed the British were still reorganizing, still repositioning after earlier skirmishes. They assumed their advance would meet only light resistance, perhaps a few scattered anti-tank guns or a retreating patrol. The British command decided to let them believe exactly that. No radio transmissions, no visible movement, no lighting, no signs of troop concentration. The anti-tank line had to look empty until the moment the Germans crossed into range. Through the early hours of the morning, British spotters observed faint dust columns far in the distance, illuminated only by the moon. The sound of engines carried across the cold night air, broken by the occasional metallic clatter that echoed between the ridges. Officers along the line whispered final range markers to their men. Ammunition runners took positions between the guns, ready to sprint through open sand the moment firing began. They all knew what would come next. The last hour before sunrise was the quietest. The desert seemed to hold itself in tension, as though listening. Gunners lay flat beside their weapons. Some pressed their faces into the crooks of their arms, trying to conserve warmth. Others watched the faint horizon for the first sliver of light. The ridge behind them shielded the final stars. Then the sky changed, turning from black to deep blue, then to a pale, cold gray. The Germans were already in motion. When the first silhouettes appeared, the British gunners felt an icy knot form in their stomachs. The tanks looked massive in the dim light, hulking shapes moving with steady confidence, their engine noise growing louder and more insistent. Dust clouds billowed behind them, rising like smoke from a great fire. The armored wave pressed forward with an assurance forged in earlier victories. They believed themselves unstoppable. The British understood that in the next few minutes, all the planning and all the preparation would either hold firm or collapse. There would be no second chance, no fallback line, no relief. If the anti-tank guns failed, the enemy would roll through them like steel crushing dry reeds. And so, when the German tanks crested the rise and moved into the open valley, the British waited, still, silent, disciplined. They allowed the enemy to come closer, and closer, and closer still, because they knew the truth written into every engagement of desert warfare. The side that strikes first is not always the side that wins, but the side that strikes first accurately, with discipline, with timing, with absolute precision, can change the fate of an entire front. And on this morning, buried in shallow pits beneath the cold light of dawn, a single British anti-tank line prepared itself to do exactly that. The first gunshots that tore into the leading German vehicles were only the beginning. What followed was a long, grinding struggle in which discipline, deception, and terrain worked together in ways the German tank commanders had not anticipated. The armored battle group that advanced across the wheat stubble and frozen earth of the eastern plains had expected scattered Soviet resistance, perhaps a few dug-in positions left over from an earlier skirmish. They did not expect the ground ahead to be prepared by hands unfamiliar to this sector. British hands, working alongside Soviet infantry to shape an unexpected combined defense. The landscape contributed to the illusion. Unlike the desert, where distance and sunlight revealed everything, the Eastern Front in late autumn offered a different kind of cover. Low fog drifted across the fields, thin but persistent, pooling in shallow depressions and settling against broken farmhouses long abandoned after earlier fighting. Birch trees with bare branches stood like thin ribs along the edges of the fields, their white bark blending with the morning haze. Trampled grass lay brown and lifeless beneath frost that had not yet melted. The natural contours of the land created small dips and rises, enough to conceal carefully sighted gun pits if observed from the wrong angle. The British crews, sent east under a special liaison mission to train Soviet anti-tank teams in the use of Lend-Lease guns, had become deeply familiar with this stretch of terrain. They studied its folds, its hidden approaches, its deceptive cover. They worked alongside Soviet engineers to dig gun pits beneath layers of frozen soil, building firing positions with precise arcs of fire that intersected at critical points along the likely German advance. Soviet infantry, seasoned and alert, positioned themselves nearby but slightly withdrawn, ready to plug gaps if the guns fell silent. The British, veterans of desert warfare who had fought Rommel's armored thrusts, recognized immediately that the Germans approaching this sector underestimated the threat before them. The German battle group had chosen its route believing it offered speed and relative safety. Recent reconnaissance flights had detected only thin Soviet positions. The broken remains of earlier battles littered the fields. Scorched trucks, splintered wagons, rusting track links half buried in mud. The Germans assumed the Soviets had retreated further east. They saw no clear defensive line. Their confidence grew with every kilometer they advanced. Their intervals tightened. Their formation became more aggressive. Panzer IVs led the assault, their long-barreled 75mm cannons pointing forward, their engines rumbling with a low, steady growl. Stu 3 assault guns followed, low silhouettes hugging the earth. Armored half-tracks trailed behind, carrying infantry meant to exploit the expected breakthrough. Behind them, still partially hidden by the morning haze, moved heavier panzers transferred from another sector, a sign that the German commanders believed a decisive push here could tear open a vulnerable seam in the front. The British gunners saw everything from their concealed positions. Through layers of brush, soil, and camouflage netting, they tracked each vehicle as it emerged from the fog. Their breath formed pale clouds in the cold air as they waited, hands steady on elevating wheels and breech handles. Nearby, Soviet scouts watched through field glasses, relaying hand signals to the British officers who had crawled into forward observation points hours earlier. The coordination, though unusual, had grown natural over weeks of joint preparations. Language mattered little when both sides communicated through maps, gestures, and shared experience. The guns were aligned, loaded, and ready. The German advance continued with unwavering certainty. Tank commanders scanned the horizon from open hatches, seeing only distant tree lines and the vague suggestion of trenches abandoned earlier in the year. The fog masked the subtle depressions where the British guns lay. It softened the angles of the ground, turning the field into a muted blur that hid the deadly geometry beneath it. Had they paused, had they deployed reconnaissance infantry or challenged the terrain with caution, the German officers might have sensed something wrong. But momentum pushed them forward. The promise of an easy breakthrough clouded their judgment. They pressed ahead. The first shots that struck the leading Panzer IVs had thrown the entire column into hesitation, but hesitation alone could not break them. The German officers shouted orders from open hatches, signaling their vehicles to fan out, redirect, and seek the source of fire. Engines roared as the battle group attempted to regain shape. Some vehicles veered to the flanks, their tracks chewing into frozen earth. Others stopped abruptly, causing the machines behind them to swerve. But the fog, rather than lifting, swirled in new patterns as the air filled with smoke from burning fuel and ignited ammunition. Visibility narrowed. Sound bounced strangely across the uneven ground, making it difficult to pinpoint the origin of the shots. The British line, still concealed, held its fire. Crews waited for their officers' signals. They understood the temptation to continue firing, but they also knew the importance of timing. A premature reveal could lead the enemy to overwhelm them with sheer numbers. The German battle group was large, its flanks still forming, its heavier tanks still approaching through the mist. If the British guns revealed their true positions too early, the Germans might break off, reposition artillery, or call in air support. Waiting increased the risk. They knew they could be shelled or spotted at any moment, but patience was their greatest weapon. Every second of restraint tightened the noose around the German advance. As German tanks spread laterally across the field to avoid clustering, they unwittingly exposed their weaker side armor to the concealed gun line. The British officers recognized this shift instantly. They signaled quietly along the trench with quick, sharp gestures. Gun captains repeated the motions. Breeches closed with metallic clicks. Elevation wheels turned. The guns adjusted by degrees. Soviet infantry crouched deeper behind their berms, bracing for the intense exchange to come. The Germans, now fully committed to the field, advanced into the overlapping arcs the British had designed. They still believed they were facing scattered Soviet resistance. They assumed the first shots had been fired by desperate defenders. Their confidence remained intact, though frayed. They pushed forward with determination until the second, more devastating volley erupted. The British unleashed their fire with grim precision. The 6-pounder guns, their barrels recoiling violently against earthen supports, fired into the flanks of advancing tanks. Penetrations were immediate. Armor plates buckled. Engines seized. Flames burst through side hatches as fuel tanks ignited. The heavier 17-pounders struck deeper targets, their high-velocity rounds punching through frontal armor that lesser guns could not have breached. Each detonation shook the frozen ground, sending shockwaves through the surrounding mist. German tank commanders realized too late that they were trapped in a crossfire engineered with mathematical precision. They ordered their vehicles to turn toward the threat, but the terrain betrayed them. Soft patches of mud beneath the frost caused some tanks to bog down. Others swung their turrets blindly, firing at shapes that dissolved into smoke and haze. Stooge 3s attempted to pivot and return fire, but their limited traverse prevented them from engaging quickly. Half-tracks scattered, their infantry spilling out into shell holes and depressions, unsure where to advance or retreat. Soviet infantry joined the fight from the rear slopes, firing anti-tank rifles and launching grenades at dismounted German troops attempting to reorganize. Their presence added another layer of confusion to the German battle groups unraveling. Officers shouted orders from hatch openings, their voices lost under the thunder of cannon fire. The battlefield dissolved into fragmentation. Vehicles burning in isolated clusters, infantry huddled behind steel hulls, smoke forming walls that cut the field into disconnected pockets of resistance. The British gunners continued firing with disciplined rhythm. Loaders slammed shells into breeches with practiced force. Spent casings rolled across dugouts and fell into the sand or mud. The smell of propellant thickened the air. Each shot was deliberate, aimed, adjusted. They were not wasting ammunition. They were dismantling an armored battle group piece by piece. The German advance had begun with confidence, speed, and strength. Now it faltered. It slowed. It staggered. And in the space of minutes, something inside the battle group broke. Not a machine, but the assumption that their armor made them invincible. For the first time, the German officers understood that the defenders ahead were not scattered or unprepared. They were not retreating. They were not overwhelmed. They were waiting, and they were British. The battlefield erupted into a crescendo of violence that shattered the fragile balance of the morning. What had begun as a controlled engagement, carefully measured volleys timed by discipline and training, now escalated into a full, all-consuming clash where every gun, every tank, and every inch of ground became decisive. The fog, once a protective veil, thickened with smoke until visibility collapsed into a mosaic of flickering flame, drifting shadows, and silhouettes that appeared and vanished like ghosts. The air trembled with the roar of engines, the crack of armor-piercing rounds, and a deep, concussive thud of explosions that reverberated through the frozen soil. The German battle group struggled to reassert control. Panzer IVs attempted to swing their long guns toward the hidden British line, their turrets grinding as they searched for targets through drifting smoke. Some fired into the haze, sending high-explosive rounds bursting into ridgelines where they believed the defenders were hiding. The blasts shook earth loose from the gun pits and showered British crews with dirt and debris. But the British positions had been chosen with precision. Their pits were dug behind subtle depressions that masked their true location. Even direct hits struck only the outer layers of frozen soil, causing more noise than damage. One Panzer IV managed to locate a faint muzzle flash in the haze. It angled toward the source and fired, its shell ripping across the field in a streak of white smoke. The impact sent a geyser of earth into the air. For a moment, the gun pit disappeared in the explosion. But when the dust settled, the British crew inside the shallow trench were already reloading, having ducked beneath the blast. The next British round struck the Panzer IV's flank armor, punching through the side plate in a burst of sparks and flame. The tank lurched violently. Its engine sputtered. Then fire poured from the commander's hatch, illuminating the fog in a violent orange glow. Elsewhere along the line, a WW2 advanced aggressively, its low profile making it harder to hit. The assault gun pushed through smoke, emerging like a dark shape rising from a storm. Its cannon fired repeatedly, hammering the hillside with explosive shells that churned the ground and shook the air. The British crews recognized the danger. The WW's frontal armor was thick, and its gun capable of devastating their positions if allowed to close the distance. A 17-pounder crew pivoted their barrel as the WW crawled closer, tracks grinding over frozen clods of earth. The gun captain steadied his sights. The loader shoved a long, slender shell into the breech. The recoil system groaned as the barrel adjusted by degrees. The fog thinned for a moment. The WW presented its right side plate. The British gun fired. The high-velocity round sliced across the battlefield and struck the WW side armor with a burst so violent it tore open the superstructure. Flames erupted from the casemate roof. The vehicle slowed, shuddered, then sank to a halt as dark smoke poured upward into the gray sky. Its destruction became a beacon, marking the turning point in the engagement. But victory carried risk. The muzzle flashes that killed the WW revealed the 17-pounder's position to the German rear elements. A Panzer IV F, its turret silhouette more angular than the earlier models, accelerated toward the ridgeline, its engine screaming under the sudden strain. It fired on the move, sending a shell crashing into the slope below the British gun. The explosion tore open the earth, sending fragments of soil and rock flying. The shockwave slammed into the gun crew. Several men staggered, momentarily blinded by dust. The next German shot struck even closer, showering the crew with splinters of frozen ground. The British responded with practiced calm. The loader rammed another shell. The gunner wiped dirt from his face, steadied himself, and adjusted his aim. The Panzer IV crested a small rise, exposing its hull. The British gun fired. The shell struck the tank's glassy plate, glanced upward, and punched into the turret ring. The turret jerked violently, then jammed. The Panzer suddenly lost momentum, swerving erratically before coming to a grinding stop. Flames soon climbed from its engine compartment. The looming threat faded into ruin. German infantry, having dismounted from half-tracks, attempted to advance under the cover of their burning vehicles. They ran through smoke-filled gullies and shallow depressions, using the chaos to obscure their movement. Some carried anti-tank rifles. Others gripped Panzerfaust launchers scavenged from supply crates. They aimed toward the gun pits, hoping to disable the British line. But Soviet infantry, lying in concealed trenches along the flanks, opened fire with bolt-action rifles, submachine guns, and light machine guns. The staccato burst cut through the German assault, forcing them to take cover behind disabled tanks or drop flat against the frozen ground. The Soviets did not advance. They held their positions with iron patience, allowing the British guns to continue their systematic destruction of the armored spearhead. The battlefield became a graveyard of steel. Flames rose from shattered hulls. Tracks spun uselessly on disabled machines. Black smoke towers climbed into the sky, mixing with fog until the horizon blurred into a single, dark mass. The air grew heavy with the smell of burning oil, cordite, and scorched metal. The ground beneath the British gun line shook continually as shells detonated across the field. A group of German tanks attempted to break away. 3 Panzer IVs and a pair of light armored cars accelerated toward the southern edge of the field, hoping to bypass the kill zone. Their engines roared at maximum power. Their tracks dug deep into the earth, sending mud flying behind them. But their maneuver carried them directly into the overlapping firing arcs of 2 British 6-pounder guns positioned lower on the slope, unseen until the moment they opened fire. The first shell struck a Panzer IV's track assembly, snapping it violently. The tank lurched sideways, immobilized. The second shell tore through the turret of the next, igniting ammunition inside. A blinding flash followed, illuminating the fog like lightning. The remaining vehicles skidded to a halt, trapped by wreckage and terrain. German officers inside their remaining tanks realized the truth. They were not simply under fire. They were being undone by geometry, by a defensive line drawn with mathematical precision across a landscape they believed empty. Each shot came from a different angle. Each gun was placed exactly where it needed to be. The British were not retreating or reacting. They were orchestrating a destruction that dismantled the battle group with surgical patience. The climax came when the heavier German tanks, vehicles that had hung back earlier in the assault, finally emerged from the fog. Their engines thundered like distant storms. Their silhouettes were larger, more imposing. These were the reinforcements transferred from another sector, armored in thicker steel and carrying formidable firepower. Their presence reignited hope among the beleaguered German crews still fighting in the burning field. But hope does not alter terrain, nor does it erase the precision of an ambush already in motion. The heavy tanks advanced straight into the arcs of the last untouched British guns. The 17-pounders, which had remained silent during the early chaos to avoid detection, now fired with devastating force. Their long barrels recoiled violently as high-velocity rounds tore across the battlefield at speeds that cracked the air like thunder. The first shot hit a heavy tank square in the lower hull. The armor deformed inward. Smoke poured from the rear deck as the engine compartment ruptured. The second 17-pounder fired moments later, striking another tank in the turret base. The turret lifted, rotated, then fell askew as flames shot upward in a violent column. German resistance disintegrated. The remaining tanks, those not burning or immobilized, attempted to reverse, but the muddy ground trapped them. Others tried to advance through the flames, only to be struck by shells that ripped through their hulls with merciless efficiency. Infantry scattered in every direction, seeking cover where none remained. The field fell silent, one gunshot at a time, as German vehicles ceased returning fire. What had begun as a confident armored thrust had become a shattering defeat. The British gun line, thin but disciplined, had held. Their precision had rewritten the course of the engagement. The German battle group, once a spear aimed at the heart of the front, now lay broken across the field in twisted shapes of steel and flame. And as the last tank fell silent, the climax of the battle resolved into a single, undeniable truth. A lone British anti-tank line had stopped a full German armored assault, and the German tank crews, stunned by the impossible geometry of their defeat, understood too late that they had driven into a trap crafted with mind, patience, and resolve. When the final engine noise faded and the last shell casing settled into the cold earth, the battlefield fell into a heavy, almost unnatural quiet. Smoke drifted across the open fields in long, pale ribbons, carrying with it the burnt metal scent of ruptured hulls and scorched fuel. Flames still flickered inside the broken remains of tanks, their shattered silhouettes casting warped shadows that danced across the frost-covered ground. The sky, once choked with dust and smoke, slowly regained its pale gray clarity. In that clarity lay the stark evidence of what had occurred. Steel that once represented strength and momentum now lay twisted, burned, and motionless across the landscape. The British anti-tank gunners, exhausted from hours of concentration and physical strain, stepped out from their shallow pits with the caution of men who had lived too long under the threat of sudden death. Their uniforms were blackened by smoke. Their faces carried the tight, silent tension of those who had watched destruction unfold at a distance measured not in miles, but in meters. Hands trembled from the repeated recoil of their guns. Some men sank to the ground beside their weapons, too drained to stand. Others remained on alert, scanning the horizon for signs that the battle had not yet ended, though they knew deep down that the German armored thrust had been broken completely. Soviet infantry moved cautiously across the field, stepping over jagged pieces of track links, spent shell casings, and fragments of shattered armor plates. They checked for survivors among the German crews, though few remained. The armored battle group had been caught in a perfect storm of terrain, discipline, and deception. British and Soviet officers surveyed the wreckage with quiet recognition. This victory did not bring celebration. It brought relief and the sober understanding of what had been prevented. If the German battle group had forced its way through this corridor, the Soviet defenses behind the ridge would have been exposed, and the fragile balance of the sector might have collapsed. The British detachment, attached to the Soviet line under an unusual wartime arrangement, had done more than hold the ground. They had altered the momentum of the entire front. The battlefield revealed the harsh geometry of the engagement. The tanks closest to the British line showed clean, precise penetrations in their side armor, evidence of timed shots fired from concealed positions. Others bore the scars of high-velocity rounds that had torn through frontal plates once thought resilient. Some hulls lay split open, their internal machinery exposed like the anatomy of fallen beasts. Crews who had once commanded these machines with confidence and pride now lay still beside them, victims of the sudden violence that had ripped through their formation. The silence around the wrecks carried a heavy weight, reminding all who walked among them that armored steel provided only an illusion of invulnerability. British gunners moved to inspect their weapons. Breech blocks were opened, cleaned, and checked. Elevation wheels were wiped free of dust and grit. Some guns had been damaged by the concussive force of near misses. Others were covered in soot. But the line, thin as it was, remained standing. Their success had not come from superior numbers, nor from overwhelming firepower. It had come from patience, from understanding the land, from recognizing exactly where the German thrust would be most exposed. It had come from a long, disciplined restraint that allowed the enemy to enter a trap, so carefully shaped that no single German officer suspected its existence until it was too late. In the aftermath, Soviet engineers moved to expand the defensive positions, preparing for the possibility that another German force might attempt the same path. British and Soviet officers gathered to study the terrain anew, marking on rough maps where German vehicles had fallen, where fire had converged, and how the engagement had unfolded in minute detail. They noted the precision of the kill zones, the effectiveness of the crossfires, and the uncanny discipline with which the British crews had timed their volleys. These records would be used to instruct Soviet anti-tank units, contributing to a growing understanding of how to withstand German armored thrusts on open ground. For the Germans who observed the battlefield from a distance, the result was incomprehensible. The armored crews, trained to rely on speed, coordination, and the resilience of their steel, now saw a graveyard of their finest machines scattered across the field. Reports carried back to German command described the engagement as sudden, devastating, and disorienting. The officers attempted to explain how a single gun line, thinly manned and positioned near a ridge they believed abandoned, could dismantle a full battle group with such precision. No explanation satisfied them. They spoke of fog, of concealed trenches, of unexpected firepower. But beneath these explanations lay the deeper truth, one that none wished to admit openly. They had misread the enemy. They had underestimated the defenders. And they had driven willingly into a killing ground prepared with a level of tactical understanding they had not expected to encounter in this sector. In the days that followed, reconnaissance aircraft flew over the area, capturing images of the battlefield that would later be analyzed by intelligence officers. The photographs showed rows of burned-out tanks, their charred remains aligned in a pattern that revealed the geometry of the ambush. Intelligence analysts traced the arcs of fire and marked the positions where the British guns had been hidden. They studied how the terrain had been shaped to misdirect the German advance. These images would eventually become part of larger reports that explained how small, well-placed anti-tank units could halt armored attacks many times their size. For the British gunners, there was no triumph in these analyses. They returned to their daily routines, repairing weapons, distributing ammunition, reinforcing positions. Some wrote brief notes in small, worn notebooks they carried with them. Others simply sat in silence, staring at the horizon as though unable to fully absorb the enormity of what they had survived. Their cooperation with the Soviet infantry would continue in the following days, but the bond forged in the crucible of the battle became something quietly understood rather than ever spoken aloud. Snow began to fall 3 days after the engagement, covering the battlefield in a thin white layer. The black shapes of the tanks became muted under the frost, their outlines softened by winter's first touch. Smoke stains on the ground darkened beneath the snowfall. The field grew silent in a different way. No longer the silence of aftermath, but the stillness of cold weather settling into the soil. The destroyed machines stood like monuments to the clash that had unfolded here, reminders of how quickly a battle could turn when terrain, timing, and resolve aligned. In the months that followed, the front moved. The line shifted westward as the Soviet advance regained momentum. New battles arose. New defensive positions were formed. New losses endured. But the memory of the stand made here remained. It traveled with the British crews when they eventually returned to their own theaters of war. It lived on in the Soviet reports that detailed the engagement and preserved its lessons. And it lingered in the minds of German officers who, having witnessed armored thrusts succeed countless times before, struggled to comprehend how a single, unexpectedly disciplined line of guns had shattered their advance so completely. War rarely allows moments of clarity, but this field, with its frozen earth and silent machines, offered one. It demonstrated that victory in war does not always belong to the largest force or the most imposing machines. Sometimes it belongs to the patient, to the disciplined, to those who understand not just how to fire but when. Sometimes it belongs to men hidden in shallow pits with cold steel in their hands, waiting for the precise moment when they can shape the fate of an entire sector with a single coordinated volley. As winter deepened and the front moved on, the wind swept across the field, carrying snow over burnt metal and filling the dents left by shells. The marks of battle faded slowly into the land, but the memory did not fade. It endured in quiet reports, in the recollections of those who survived, and in the hard lessons learned by those who underestimated a defense that appeared thin but struck with devastating precision. One truth emerged, clear and undeniable. The German tank crews were stunned because they believed no single gun line could destroy an armored advance. They learned, in the hardest possible way, that belief has no power against a well-placed line of guns, a patient crew, and a moment of perfect timing. And the battlefield, now silent under a thin layer of snow, held the memory of the day when steel confidence met disciplined resolve and broke.